Hey guys, Brian here from Thumper Fab. Today I'm going to walk you through installing your long travel on your Ranger 1500 XD. The first step in installing your Thumper Fab long travel on your Ranger 1500 is removing all the factory suspension. You'll remove the control arms, the shock, tie rod, knuckle, axle, and brake lines. With your front brake lines replaced with the kit and your long travel, you can go ahead and move forward. Included with your long travel kit will be a set of tie rods. This is your inner tie rod. For the inner tie rod to be able to go inside the steering rack, you'll have to remove this boot. We'll use a pick, find the end of the spring, when you find the end of the spring, you'll use your pick to remove it so you can remove the boot from the inner tie rod end. When you remove the boot, it'll allow the tie rod end to fully insert inside the steering rack. With your inner tie rod modified, you'll slide the provided boot over the threads of the inner tie rod and thread it into the tie rod body. Then you'll be able to tighten the inner tie rod into the steering rack in preparation for the arm install. With your inner tie rod end tightened, you'll slide the boot over the steering rack and fasten it with a zip tie. With your tie rod fully installed, the next step in the process will be installing your lower control arm. With your lower control arm loosely installed, you'll go ahead and install the axle. All the fasteners you'll want to leave loose until everything's bolted up, and then you can tighten evenly. For the next step in the process, you'll go ahead and attach your knuckle to your lower control arm, being sure to feed your axle through it before you attach it to the lower ball joint. For your next step in the installation, you'll install your upper control arm using your OEM hardware. Now, using your OEM hardware, you'll fasten your upper ball joint to the knuckle. With our Thumper Fab long travel, you have the option of running your OEM shocks. If you choose to run your OEM shocks, you'll receive OEM shock relocation brackets and spacers. The spacers will take the place in between the frame rails of the factory shocks, and you'll place your OEM shock relocation brackets on the outside of the frame. The next step in the installation process will be mounting the shocks. On this install, we decided not to go with the OEM shocks, so we don't need any OEM shock relocation brackets. For the upper mount of the shock, you'll use the outermost hole to provide the most travel. Control arm. For the next step in the process, you'll attach your tie rod to the knuckle using your steering pin. First, you'll feed it through the hub. Loosely fastening on the bottom. With your steering pin loosely fastened to the knuckle, you use your misalignments to attach your steering pin to the heim and the tie rod assembly. The next step in the process, you'll install your brake rotor and brake caliper. With your axle through the rotor, you'll go ahead and reinstall your axle nut. With your axle nut reinstalled and your brake rotor fastened to the unit, you'll go ahead and install your brake caliper before we get to the sway bar. With your brake caliper mounted to the knuckle, you'll fasten your brake line to the arm using zip ties on the provided brake line tabs. With your brakes fully installed, the last step is to install the lower end of your sway bar link. You'll use the factory hardware and feed it through from front to back. With your brake lines ran and mounted to your calipers, you can go ahead and begin the installation of the arms on the unit. The next step in the installation of your long travel, you'll go ahead and install the lower control arm on the rear. For the next step in the installation, you'll go ahead and mount your knuckle to the lower control arm. With your knuckle mounted to your lower control arm, you can go ahead and insert the axle into the differential and feed it through the knuckle. Once you have your axle ran through the knuckle, you can go ahead and install your axle nut and weight tighten evenly at the end of the installation process. With your axle nut mounted, you can go ahead and move on to the installation of the upper control arm using the factory hardware. Once you have your upper control arm mounted to the frame, you can go ahead and fasten it to the knuckle. Shocks. If you run your stock shocks, these are OEM shock relocation brackets for the rear. They'll work similarly to the front. You'll have brackets and spacers to replace the width of the shock eye and the frame rails. Similar to the front, we aren't using the relocation brackets for the OEM shock. You're going to use your aftermarket shock. When using an aftermarket shock, you want to use the furthest out hole on the frame, and it'll give you the most travel. With your shock mounted to the frame, you'll lift up on the knuckle a little bit and fasten the lower portion of the shock to the lower control arm. Once you have your shock fully installed, you can move on to mount the brake caliper. With your caliper mounted to the knuckle, you can go ahead and fasten your brake lines to the brake line tabs provided on the upper control arm. The last step in the installation on the rear long travel, you're going to go ahead and reattach your sway bar link using the factory hardware. With all your components installed for the long travel kit, what you want to do is set the bike down on the ground, check your toe and adjust if needed, make sure you bleed your brakes thoroughly, and you're ready to hit the trails.